The surgeon didn't scream until the thing moved. That was the moment everything changed. They opened Frank Mason's back expecting a simple bullet fragment. What they found instead was alive. A foreign mass, writhing, conscious, and somehow remembering. What if trauma could think? What if war left something behind? Not just in memory, but in flesh. Stay with us, because this story will take you from a quiet Midwestern town to the haunted jungles of Vietnam and into a truth buried deeper than any grave. If stories like this make you feel something, hit subscribe. There's more than memory waiting in the next chapter. It was supposed to be a routine procedure. At least that's what Dr. Rebecca Winters told herself, as she stood beneath the pale, sterile glow of the aura light. The hum of the monitor, the muted clinks of surgical tools, the whispering hush of latex gloves, these were her lullabies in the quiet theater of modern medicine. But today, the air felt heavier, almost pregnant with hesitation. Frank Mason lay face down on the surgical table, shirtless and still, anesthetized into silence. His back, weathered and freckled from 6 decades of sun, labor, and stubborn neglect, rose and fell with slow, deliberate breaths. Centered just below his left shoulder blade was a mass, roughly the size of a silver dollar, dark and dense under the skin. Dr. Winters had seen her share of odd growths, cysts, carcinomas, fibromas. Things with names and codes, things that didn't surprise her anymore. But this was different. She had first seen Frank a week earlier. He had come in begrudgingly, his wife Eleanor trailing close behind him, clutching his medical records like they were evidence from a crime scene. Eleanor had insisted. She had taken photos of the growth, video too. She had tracked its changes over months. It's not just a mole, she said. It's moving. Doctors don't like that word, moving, not when it's about something under the skin. At first, Dr. Winters had smiled, reassuring, professional. It's probably a lipoma, she said, or a sebaceous cyst. They can shift under pressure. But she had ordered a scan anyway. What she saw had kept her up that night. The mass had density, complexity. It was surrounded by layers of fibrous tissue, too orderly, too engineered for something nature had put there. It almost looked designed. Now, with scalpel in hand, she made the first incision. The skin split like fruit under the blade, exposing the fatty tissue beneath. Her hands were steady. She had done this hundreds of times, but as she went deeper, the resistance increased. The tissue around the mass was unlike anything she'd seen, tight rope-like strands as if the body had constructed a tiny self-contained prison. She paused. "Retractor," she said quietly. The nurse handed it to her without question. With gentle pressure, she pulled back the surrounding tissue. The room fell into silence. What lay beneath was not a cyst, not a tumor, not a clump of cells gone rogue. It was metal. No, something encased in metal. A dull gray shell, irregular in shape, with what looked like decades of oxidation. But what caught Dr. Winters' eye wasn't the object itself. It was the way the tissue had formed around it. It was as if the body hadn't tried to reject it, but had chosen to protect it. The silence broke when one of the nurses, Patricia, a 30-year veteran, let out an involuntary gasp. "What is that?" someone whispered. Dr. Winters didn't answer. Her mind was racing. She had never seen a human body do this. The way the tissue spiraled and enclosed the object, almost like a cocoon. This wasn't infection or defense. It was containment, deliberate, purposeful. She reached in with forceps, gently prying the object loose. As she lifted it from the wound, something unsettling happened. The surrounding tissue twitched. Not spasm, not nerve reaction. It was too coordinated, too slow. Patricia took a step back. Jesus! The operating room went still. Dr. Winters stared at the object now resting in her gloved palm. It was not military grade. It wasn't medical. It had no markings, no serials. But it was sharp, compact, and unmistakably forged, a fragment of a bullet. But not any bullet she had seen. The intercom buzzed. Vital stable, came the voice from monitoring. But no one moved. No one spoke. Behind the thick glass of the OR viewing window, Eleanor Mason stood with her hand over her mouth. Her eyes were locked on the small, dark shape being dropped into a specimen cup. Her breath fogged the window in front of her. She had seen enough to know this was not a simple mole. And somewhere beneath the veil of sedation, Frank Mason stirred. Outside the operating room, winter had blanketed the town of Millfield, Michigan, in silence. Snow fell in slow spirals, coating mailboxes, porch swings, and dormant gardens in a hush that muffled time itself. The world looked peaceful from the outside, but inside the Mason home, beneath warm lights and framed photos of a life well lived, something quiet and unsettling had begun to stir. Frank Mason sat in his worn recliner by the fireplace, a wool blanket draped across his legs. The light from the flames danced in his eyes, but he didn't seem to notice. His stare was fixed, not at the fire but into it, as if trying to see something deeper. Eleanor, sitting across from him with a cup of chamomile tea, watched him without speaking. 46 years of marriage had taught her when not to prod, but tonight the silence between them wasn't the usual kind. It was taut, alive, shifting like smoke. She sipped her tea. "You barely touched your dinner." Frank blinked, as if just returning to the room. "Wasn't hungry." She nodded, letting it go. For now, in the corner of the living room, a box of Christmas decorations sat unopened. Emma, their 9-year-old granddaughter, had begged to help decorate this weekend. But now, with Frank's condition, plans had changed. Eleanor stood and walked to the kitchen. She moved carefully, methodically, the way women who've kept homes for decades move. Efficient but unhurried. As she rinsed her mug, she looked out the window into the snow-covered yard. There, under the bare branches of the sycamore tree, was the old swing Frank had built for Lily when she was little. That was a long time ago, before medical school, before Chicago, before the silence settled in between father and daughter like the frost that refused to melt. Eleanor dried her hands. Her eyes moved to the calendar pinned beside the fridge. A date was circled in red, December 9th, the day she'd made Frank's appointment with Dr. Winters. A battle she'd fought quietly, slowly, for months. She had known something was wrong long before the growth appeared. She'd felt it in his sleep, the tremors, the murmurs, the sudden, ragged breath that always came at 3:13 a.m., like clockwork. Frank never talked about Vietnam, never. She had asked. Once, just once. "I left it there," he said. "I suggest you do the same." And she had. For decades. But the body never forgets. The sound of footsteps on the stairs pulled her out of thought. Emma, in fuzzy slippers and a tangle of curly hair, appeared at the doorway, clutching a glass of water. "Grandma," she whispered, "I had a bad dream." Eleanor knelt. "What did you dream about, honey?" Emma hesitated. "I saw something on Grandpa's back, like a spider. But it wasn't really a spider. It moved. It had legs, but they were under his skin." Eleanor's heart dropped. She smiled gently, brushing Emma's hair. It was just a dream, but her fingers trembled. The next morning, Eleanor changed the bandage on Frank's back. He said nothing as she peeled away the gauze, but when she saw the skin, she froze. The wound from surgery was healing, but above it, just an inch from the sutures, something else had formed. A slight ridge, barely perceptible unless you were looking for it. But she was, and it pulsed. She leaned closer, breath caught. It moved, only slightly, just enough to raise the skin like the ripple of a water droplet in stillness. But it was enough. Frank turned his head toward her. His voice was quiet. "You saw it, didn't you?" She didn't answer. "I felt it too," he said. "Last night, like it was crawling, again." She looked at him then, not just his face, but into it, into the man she married, the man who had carried silence like a second spine. "Frank," she whispered, "what happened to you over there?" He looked away, toward the window, toward the snow. "I don't know," he said. "Not anymore." That evening, while Frank slept, Eleanor did something she'd never done before. She filmed him. Quietly from the hallway, she recorded his back as he lay on his side. The blankets had slipped low. The skin over his shoulder blade was visible. At first, nothing. Then, at the 13-second mark, the skin shuddered. Not muscle spasm, not breath. Movement, from within. Eleanor stopped recording, her hands shaking. She didn't sleep that night. She sat in the kitchen with the lights off, staring at the screen of her phone, watching the video over and over. And somewhere around 3 a.m., she made a decision. She would not let this stay buried. Not this time. Eleanor Mason had never considered herself the hysterical type. She came from a generation of women taught to fold their anxieties into laundry baskets and bake them into pies. You handled your fears the way you handled winter, with layers, with silence, with a kind of quiet defiance. But the night she watched the video of Frank's back, watched the skin shift under the pale glow of the bedside lamp, something inside her cracked. She watched the clip again before dawn, her face lit only by the bluish glare of her phone. The movement was real. She'd seen it, filmed it, played it frame by frame. It wasn't imagination or paranoia. It wasn't a dream shared between an old man and a worried wife. It was something alive, or at least something still responding. And it was inside her husband. By 7:15 a.m., Eleanor was dressed in her best church coat, scarf pinned tightly beneath her chin. Frank remained asleep, if that's what one could call it. His breathing had been shallow, erratic. Several times during the night he'd muttered in half-sleep, fragments of sentences that made her blood run cold. They're watching. Not again. Not in the trees this time. She had red sandals. Little girl, little. Eleanor didn't wake him. She kissed his temple and left the house with her phone clenched tight in her glove. By 8:03 a.m. she was standing in the reception area of Dr. Grayson's clinic, the same office that had dismissed her concerns for months. The front desk nurse, a pleasant round-faced woman named Marcy, looked up from her computer and smiled politely. "Mrs. Mason, you don't have an appointment this morning, do you?" "No," Eleanor said calmly, "but my husband might not survive the weekend if you don't let me speak to the doctor." Something in her voice silenced the room. 10 minutes later, Eleanor sat across from Dr. Grayson in his small oak-paneled office. She placed her phone on the desk, tapped play, and slid it forward. The room fell quiet except for the soft whir of the baseboard heater and the video's ambient sound, rustling sheets, Frank's labored breath, and then, at the 13-second mark, the unmistakable ripple beneath the skin. Dr. Grayson leaned forward, replayed it, rewound, watched again, his brow furrowed. "I've seen muscle fasciculations before," he began, his tone searching, "but this seems different." Eleanor said nothing. She didn't need to. Grayson sat back. "This is beyond me. I want to refer him immediately to a specialist." "You already met Dr. Winters, didn't you?" "Dermatologic oncology. She's sharp, Harvard-educated. Came to Michigan to be closer to her father, who's in long-term care here." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Can she see him today?" Grayson didn't hesitate. "I'll make the call myself." By the time Eleanor returned home, Frank was awake and seated at the kitchen table, slowly peeling an orange with fingers that trembled slightly. He didn't look up as she entered, but she saw the question in his posture. "You made an appointment," he said. "I did." He paused. "With her? The young one?" "She may be young," Eleanor replied, hanging up her coat, "but she's the first one who didn't dismiss me like I was a nervous housewife." Frank didn't argue. That in itself was new. That afternoon, as snow thickened across the highway shoulders, they drove together to the clinic. The car ride was mostly silent. Eleanor kept her hands folded in her lap, watching the frost edge along the window. Frank stared straight ahead, jaw set. Dr. Winters greeted them promptly. She had the brisk confidence of someone used to high stakes, but there was warmth in her eyes as she shook Frank's hand. Her office smelled faintly of eucalyptus and sterilized cotton. "We're going to take another look," she said. "I want to run imaging before I do anything else. We have a new ultrasound suite here. It'll be quick." Frank said nothing as he removed his shirt and lay face down on the padded table. Eleanor stood in the corner, clutching her purse, unable to tear her gaze away. The probe glided across his back, cool gel shining under the light. On the monitor, the layers of tissue unfolded like waves, skin, fat, fascia. Then came the anomaly. Dr. Winters narrowed her eyes. "There it is," she whispered. The screen showed a new formation, distinct from the original surgical site. An irregular object, no bigger than a coin, but moving, not shifting with breath or muscle tension, contracting, expanding, curling in on itself like a fist made of flesh. She increased the frequency. The object responded. It twitched. Dr. Winters slowly turned toward Eleanor. "I need to biopsy this." Eleanor nodded, but Frank, eyes closed, spoke up. "No more cutting." "We need to know what this is," Dr. Winters said gently. "Whatever was removed before, it wasn't the only thing." Frank opened his eyes. They were bloodshot but sharp. "You think I don't know that?" Eleanor stepped forward, placing a hand on his arm. "Frank," but he flinched, then, visibly winced and gasped as if something inside him had just moved. Dr. Winters immediately pressed the emergency button. The nurse rushed in. Frank's vitals spiked, heart rate climbing, oxygen dipping. On the screen, the object pulsed violently, then stopped. Stillness. Frank collapsed back against the table, breath heaving. Eleanor stood frozen, not in fear, in realization. Whatever was inside her husband, it wasn't done yet. Frank Mason was admitted for observation that same evening. His vitals had stabilized by the time the stretcher wheels clicked into place in the private suite. The snowstorm outside had strengthened, wind howling low against the windows like an old animal trying to get in. Nurses moved efficiently, hooking monitors, adjusting IVs, but their eyes lingered just a beat longer than normal each time they looked at Frank. They had heard. The whispers had already begun. The thing under his skin, the video, the surgical fragment now labeled biological anomalous metallic. No one used the word parasite out loud, but it hung in the air like antiseptic. Eleanor stayed beside him. She didn't cry, didn't panic. She took notes. There was a certain coldness to her resolve now, born not of fear but of momentum. For too long she had accepted the silence, the evasions, the murmured nightmares at 3 a.m. Now something was rising. Inside Frank, yes, but inside her too. Something long buried. Something that refused to stay quiet any longer. When the nurse offered her a cot, she declined. At 1:12 a.m., as Frank dozed under the mild sedative, Dr. Winters entered with a file and a tight expression. "I ran the tissue analysis," she said, her voice low. "It's not just scar formation or inflammation. The sample shows signs of organized cellular response, almost like an adaptive sheath forming around the foreign object." Eleanor frowned. "Like armor?" Dr. Winters hesitated. "Not armor, more like preservation. The cells aren't rejecting the object, they're nurturing it." Eleanor stared at her. "You're saying his body's protecting it?" "I'm saying," Dr. Winters said slowly, "that whatever it is, it's been here for a very long time, and it hasn't been dormant. It's been changing, growing even, but in a way that's hard to categorize. It's not just reacting, it's participating." She laid down an image, a high-resolution tissue scan. The mass was now visibly branching, tendrils of organic matter lacing outward, slowly infiltrating surrounding muscle. Eleanor studied the image. "How is he not in constant pain?" Dr. Winters nodded solemnly. "That's the thing, the body seems to have adapted, like it was taught not to fight it." By morning, Frank was more lucid. He said little, but Eleanor could see the tension in his face, the quiet calculation in his eyes. His hand gripped the railing with white-knuckled pressure, as if bracing against something unseen. "You should call Lily," he said. Eleanor blinked. "You sure? She deserves to know." Eleanor made the call. Lily answered on the second ring. The conversation was short, clinical. Her voice carried that distant efficiency only seasoned ER physicians possessed, equal parts exhaustion and steel. But Eleanor could tell something cracked when she explained the biopsy. "I'll be on the road in an hour," Lily said. "Tell Dad. Just tell him I'm coming." By afternoon the sky had darkened again, storm clouds bleeding over the horizon. Eleanor returned home briefly to collect a few things. The house was quiet, too quiet. Even the hum of the refrigerator felt amplified in the stillness. As she passed Frank's old workshop, the shed in the backyard she had always referred to as his cave, something pulled at her. She hadn't stepped inside for over a year. He had stopped using it after his knees gave out, but never let her clean it. "Private," he'd said. The padlock was still rusted, but yielded easily under the old key. Inside, the scent hit her first. Wood shavings, oil, and something faintly metallic. His old workbench sat under the window, tools arranged with military precision. But what caught her eye was the cabinet in the far corner, half hidden under a tarp and an old flannel shirt. She opened it slowly. Inside was a small metal box, locked with a 3-digit combination. She knew it instantly. His fallback, his failsafe, their anniversary, 427. The lock clicked. The lid creaked. Inside was a folded envelope yellowed with time. A military patch, torn, singed at one edge. A photograph, black and white, folded twice, showing a group of young soldiers posed in front of a jungle clearing. Frank was in the center, his face younger, leaner, but unmistakably guarded. There was also something else, a small fragment of metal, smooth, curved like a sliver of bone. It shimmered slightly in the light, not quite silver, not quite gray. Eleanor's breath caught as she realized. It matched the one removed from his back, not just in shape, but in material. There had been 2, maybe more. Back at the hospital, Lily arrived just past dusk. She entered the room briskly, medical bag still slung across her shoulder. Her eyes went straight to the monitor, then to her father. "Hi, Dad," Frank nodded. "Hey, Doc." The old tension between them hadn't disappeared, but something about the room, about Frank's face, softened her. She checked his charts, asked Dr. Winters for a moment alone with him. Eleanor waited outside, sitting on the hallway bench, the metal box in her lap. She didn't open it again. She didn't need to. For the first time in decades, the truth had weight, and she was ready to carry it. The sky over Millfield bled a deeper gray that morning, as if the clouds themselves had grown heavy with unspoken truths. Inside St. Vincent Memorial, the hallways pulsed with routine. The soft shuffle of nurses' soles, the muted beep of monitors, the low murmur of medication carts. But in room 204B, nothing felt routine anymore. Frank Mason lay propped against the incline of his hospital bed, his skin pale, almost waxen. The monitor at his side displayed a heart rate that rose and fell in erratic peaks, like a man constantly sprinting in his dreams. Beside the bed, Eleanor clutched the small metal box she had found the night before. Her fingers trembled slightly, but not from fear. The weight of the contents wasn't heavy in grams, but in memory, in silence, in secrets that no longer had the luxury of staying buried. Frank's breath rattled once, sharp and deep. His eyes fluttered open. "You found it," he murmured. Eleanor nodded. "I did." He looked past her, toward the window. "Then you know." "I know enough," she whispered, "but I want to know all of it." Before he could answer, a knock at the door interrupted them. It was Dr. Winters, clipboard in hand, her eyes shadowed with concern. "I've reviewed the latest scans," she said, stepping closer. "The second mass is accelerating in growth. Whatever it's doing, it's not passive anymore." Eleanor stood. "You mean it's attacking him?" Dr. Winters shook her head. "Not quite. It's replicating. Not just expanding tissue, but generating structure. There's symmetry, order. It's forming something." Frank let out a soft, bitter laugh. "Of course it is. That's what it did the first time." Both women turned toward him. Frank exhaled slowly. "You think this is new? I've felt this before. In the jungle. In that village?" His voice was dry but steady now, like stone rolling downhill. "There was an explosion," he continued. "Not ours. Something else. I was in a clearing when the blast came. I blacked out. Woke up half buried under foliage, ribs broken, shoulder burning. There was something embedded in me." He paused. "But I didn't go to the medic. I didn't report it. I pulled rank, ordered a wrap-up, claimed it was shrapnel from a mortar." Dr. Winters leaned forward. "And it stayed in you, all this time?" Frank nodded. "I think part of me knew, but I was 24. I didn't want to get pulled from the field. I didn't want to explain why I couldn't protect that village, why I hesitated." Eleanor opened the metal box and handed him the photo, the one with the jungle clearing and the group of soldiers, younger versions of ghosts. Frank stared at it, then pointed. "Him, Harris. Our commanding officer, said we had intel the village was harboring VC, ordered a sweep. But when we got there, it was just women, kids, elders." Eleanor sat beside him. "You tried to stop him?" Frank nodded. "I put my rifle down, refused the order." His hand clenched the edge of the blanket. He fired anyway. The room grew still. "I was hit when I stepped between him and a woman trying to shield her son. Bullet went in and came out, but something else stayed behind." Dr. Winters exchanged a glance with Eleanor. "You think what we're seeing now came from that moment?" Frank nodded again. "I never knew what it was, only that I started feeling different. Dreams, sensations, like something was watching through me. And then the headaches, the heat, the sense that something was building inside." He looked at the ceiling, but after a few years it stopped. "Until now," Eleanor whispered. Dr. Winters straightened. "We need to get it out. Now. While we still can." In the surgical suite, the mood was tenser than usual. Dr. Winters had requested a full team. Lily Mason, already scrubbed in, stood at the opposite side of the table, focused and professional. For the first time in years, she wasn't Frank's daughter. She was the physician he trusted enough to cut him open. As anesthesia took hold, Frank's features slackened. His heart rate steadied. The room fell into rhythm. Murmurs of protocol, suction checks, scalpel prepped. Then the first incision. Lily parted the skin carefully, layer by layer. As they reached the second anomaly, the instruments met resistance. Not the kind born of scar or infection, but something far stranger. The mass was smooth, glossy, like metal that had somehow become part of the flesh around it. Dr. Winters held up the probe. Pressure is normalizing. But just as she reached toward the object, the monitor spiked. Frank's limbs twitched. The muscle around the mass flexed as if resisting intrusion. "It's reacting," Lily shouted. "Administer paralytic," Winters ordered. The nurse complied. But then the unthinkable happened. The tissue surrounding the object began to shift, not rupture, but realign, like tendons weaving together. It was forming a shape, not random, not organic. It was forming a point, a tip. Lily stepped back, eyes wide. "Oh my God," she whispered. "It's rebuilding itself." The surgical theater was silent, the kind of silence that settles when something defies logic, when even the most experienced hands hesitate, not out of uncertainty, but awe. On the table, the object embedded in Frank Mason's back was no longer just a foreign body. It had become something else, something deliberate. Dr. Winters stared at the shape now emerging from the tissue. It glistened under the light, slightly curved, precisely tapered at one end. Not rusted, not corroded, smooth, sharp. A bullet, not one that had been fired, one that had been rebuilt. The tissue around it wasn't just muscle or scar, it had molded into symmetry, a cocoon of living matter that had replicated the original form. Like a memory made physical, Lily Mason stepped back, her breath catching in her throat. She had seen tumors grow blood vessels, had seen cells divide with terrifying speed, but this wasn't biology, it was intent. "What the hell is it doing?" she asked softly. Dr. Winters shook her head. "I don't know, but we're not removing it by force." She turned to the anesthesiologist. "Keep him under. Prep for neural mapping. We're going to scan first." The team worked quickly. Frank's vitals were stable but reactive. His brain showed intermittent spikes of activity, REM bursts, theta waves, dreaming, but deeper, almost communicative. As the tech slid the neural array into place, Frank's body stiffened, and then he spoke. But not to anyone in the room. "Harris." His voice was low, breathy, as if spoken through grit and memory. "You knew. It wasn't clean. They were just children." The surgical staff froze. "Harris, don't." Frank gasped, arched slightly, and then went limp again. The room was frozen for several seconds before Dr. Winters signaled to end the procedure. "Let him rest," she said. "Whatever this is, it's not finished with him." An hours later, Frank lay in post-op, his body calm, the synthetic sedative keeping him somewhere between memory and forgetting. Outside his room, in the waiting area, Eleanor sat with the metal box on her lap. Lily stood behind her, arms crossed, the way she always did when trying to protect herself from too much feeling. "Why didn't he ever tell me?" Lily asked, voice low. Eleanor opened the box again, pulled out the final item, a sealed envelope, yellowed and fragile. "Maybe because he didn't think he deserved to." Lily sat down. "You think this, whatever it is, started back then?" "I think it never really ended." She opened the letter. "Dear Ellie, if you're reading this, it means I didn't find the courage to tell you in time. That's the kind of man I've been, I guess. Brave when bullets fly, but cowardly in the silence that follows. There was a village. I think about it every day. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. We were told it was a base for Viet Cong, but it wasn't. Just families. A wedding had just ended. There were still flowers in the street. Harris gave the order. I refused. I thought the others would back me up, but they didn't. I got shot for stepping in front of a woman and her son. The bullet went clean through. But something else stayed. I didn't know what. Still don't. After that day, strange things started. Dreams, visions, a heat in my spine. I'd wake up shaking. It got worse when I tried to talk about it, so I stopped talking altogether. I think whatever lodged in me was watching, waiting. Maybe it's part of what we dropped on them. Maybe it's punishment. Maybe it's justice. I don't know. But I know I couldn't tell Lily. I couldn't face her with this thing inside me, both real and not. If this ever reaches you, and you find the other piece, tell her. Tell her the truth. Tell her I tried to stop it. I just didn't stop it in time." Frank and Eleanor folded the letter carefully. Lily wiped her eyes. Neither spoke. The silence between them was no longer cold. It had changed. It was a silence shared by survivors, those who stayed behind, and those who returned in pieces. Just then, the door to the hallway swung open. A man entered. Late 60s, denim jacket worn thin at the elbows, a limp in his left leg. "Eleanor?" She looked up. "Tommy Williams," he said. "Served with Frank. Got your message." He removed his cap and sat slowly, eyes flicking to the box in her hands. "You found the fragments?" She nodded. "2 so far." Tommy leaned forward. There were more. Her breath caught. "More?" Tommy nodded grimly. "There was a recon unit. 3 of us went missing for 72 hours in the jungle after a firefight. When they found us, we all had the same thing. Entry wound, no exit. but no bullet either. He looked down at his palm. One of them, Johnson, died 2 years later. Brain hemorrhage. When they autopsied him, they found a cluster of tissue wrapped around something hard. They buried the file. Lily stepped forward. "You're saying this isn't just him?" "I'm saying whatever it is. It's not just in Frank." Tommy looked past them, toward the door of the room where Frank lay still. "He was the only one who fought the order that day," he said. "The only one who stood in front of the villagers." He turned back to Eleanor. Maybe that's why it stayed with him. Maybe it saw something. And night fell quietly over Millfield. Inside the hospital room, Frank stirred once more. The dream returned, the jungle, the clearing. The moment when time fractured and never truly repaired itself. But this time, when he turned, he didn't see Harris. He saw a boy. The one he saved, standing in the same place, still holding his mother's hand. He smiled, and the pain lessened. Just a little. It had been more than 50 years since Eleanor Mason had last thought about Quang Tri in full color. She had learned, as many survivors do, how to press traumatic memory into black and white. Blurred edges, distant sounds, cropped faces. It was easier that way, cleaner. The way old photographs sometimes fade, not because time forgets, but because the soul demands it. But that morning, as she sat by Frank's bedside, listening to the steady beep of the monitor, the fog of time lifted. The past came not as a memory, but as a return. Vietnam, 1971. The heat was unlike anything she had ever known. It didn't sit on the skin. It crawled, a humid breathing thing that clung to every inch of fabric and thought. Eleanor was 23, a nurse with the Red Cross, stationed at a temporary field hospital in Quang Tri, just miles from the demilitarized zone. She had signed up with a mixture of patriotism and rebellion, eager to leave the stillborn future waiting for her back home in Ohio. And then came the village. It was the day after a mission gone wrong. Word had reached the compound of civilian complications. That was the phrase they used. Collateral misunderstanding was another. Eleanor never trusted euphemisms. She was assigned to triage the survivors. The truck ride there was silent. No soldiers joked. No radios played. When they arrived, the village was half ash and half silence. Smoke still curled from the ruins of a schoolhouse. A goat bleated somewhere in the brush, confused and tetherless. She remembered the first thing she saw, a child, maybe 7, with a head wound wrapped in cloth too red to be clean. He sat by a woman, his mother, probably, who stared blankly ahead, lips moving silently in prayer or madness. Eleanor worked quickly. Dressings, fluids, morphine, but her hands trembled. She wasn't used to children, not broken ones. And then came the boy. He was maybe 5 years old, barefoot, with a cut along his ribs that had already started to fester. But that wasn't what caught her attention. It was his eyes. They were too still, too old. She remembered kneeling beside him, brushing dirt from his arms. He didn't flinch, didn't cry, just looked at her with the stillness of a stone that had been watching the sea for centuries. When she applied antiseptic to the wound, he finally reacted, not in pain but in something stranger. His body shivered, and the skin around the gash tightened unnaturally, almost recoiling. She touched it again, and the tissue rippled, not muscle spasm but response. It was then she noticed something small lodged near his hip, barely the size of a coin, metal. But when she tried to extract it, the boy shook his head violently. "No," she froze. "You speak English?" He didn't answer, just stared. Another nurse came over, distracted her, took the boy away. She never saw him again. But that sensation, that movement under the skin, stayed with her. Back in the present, Eleanor stared out the hospital window. The sky was heavy again, Michigan snow swirling in flurries that looked like ghosts drifting sideways. Frank stirred beside her. His hand flexed. A low murmur escaped his lips. She leaned close. "I'm here." He whispered something barely audible. She leaned closer still. "The boy," he said. He saw it. She blinked. Saw what? But he was already fading back into sleep. She sat back in her chair, mind racing. The tissue, the reaction, the boy in Quang Tri. It couldn't be coincidence. What if the thing inside Frank, the fragment, the mimicry, the response, hadn't just been reacting to him, but to someone else? What if it was part of something larger? And later that afternoon, a new presence entered the picture. A man in a tailored suit arrived at the hospital, accompanied by 2 representatives from a department of biomedical intelligence. The hospital administrator called them government. Dr. Winters called them something else, vultures. They requested access to Frank's tissue samples, neural scans, and a full psychological history. The hospital, bound by protocols and grants, complied. When Eleanor heard, she walked into the administrator's office without knocking. "He's not a specimen," she said, voice cold as steel. The administrator looked up, surprised. "Mrs. Mason, I assure you." "No," she interrupted. "You don't assure me of anything. You assure them, whoever they are. Men in suits who think that because they have acronyms on their badges, they get to take pieces of the people we love." He shifted uncomfortably. "They're offering full federal protection. They say he may be biologically significant. He's not a phenomenon," she said, almost trembling. "He's my husband." There was silence, and then she leaned forward, quieter now. "If you try to take him, I will go to the press, and not just local." He nodded slowly. "You have my word. No further access unless you approve." Eleanor left the office, chest tight but calm. She had spent too many years waiting for someone to fight for Frank. Now it was her turn. That night she returned to his bedside. She brought the letter again, the photo, the bullet casing. She laid them out like relics. Then from her own coat pocket, she retrieved something she hadn't touched in decades, a journal. Leather-bound, soft from years of handling. Her Vietnam log. She had written every night after triage. Fragmented notes, observations, partial names, dates, smells. She flipped to the page dated May 9, 1971. Boy with shallow cut. Unusual tissue response. Eyes too still. Refuse removal of metal. Mark near the hip. Triangle scar, faint shimmer. Not local shrapnel. Moved under my fingers. Her hands trembled. It was real. It had started there. The old journal rested open in Eleanor's lap. For over 50 years she had carried it across state lines, through seasons of grief and silence, tucked away in drawers, boxes, memory. But now, its words burned with clarity, ink no longer faded, but sharp, pulsing like veins reconnecting across time. The boy, the wound that moved, the metallic shimmer beneath soft skin, the refusal to be touched. It had all begun there. She flipped pages frantically now, nights scrawled with feverish shorthand, half-formed thoughts pressed between morphine dosages and injury counts. Then she found it. A soldier visited the next morning, badge redacted on uniform, tall, quiet, American accent, not from base, took the boy, gave no name, said he was classified now. No one questioned it, not even the chaplain. Eleanor swallowed hard. She had buried the moment, labeled it fog of war. But now, it rose again, sharp and crystalline. The man who had arrived in an unmarked jeep, flanked by 2 armed escorts, who had spoken gently to the boy in perfect Vietnamese, and who had vanished with him before dawn. She had told herself it was a dream, but it wasn't. That same symbol, triangle with a central dot, had appeared again. On the scan from Frank's back. Back at the hospital, Frank had grown restless. Though still sedated, he murmured often now, more vividly, more frequently. But it wasn't just his words that startled the staff. It was the language. Vietnamese, fluent, fast, accented like a native speaker. None of them understood it, but Eleanor did, enough to recognize phrases, names, Thang Bi, Bin Yen, Dung Ban. She sat beside him, stunned. Frank hadn't spoken Vietnamese since he'd come home. In fact, he'd refused to speak it even in jest, when old war buddies teased him about his jungle tongue. He'd said it hurt his throat, said it made him sweat. But now, in the throes of sleep, he spoke it like it had never left him, as if it was returning. Dr. Winters reviewed the latest neurological scan and found elevated activity in the hippocampus, memory retrieval. But what made her pause was the activity in the Wernicke's and Broca's areas, centers for speech and language. "It's like his brain is reorganizing," she told Eleanor, "as if it's reverting, or being triggered." "By what?" Eleanor asked. "By whatever is still active inside him." And that evening, as snow dusted the windows like ash from a far-off fire, Eleanor did what she had not done in decades. She called a contact from the war. Father Thomas McCleary, now retired and living in rural Oregon, had once been a chaplain stationed in Dong Ha, just north of the demilitarized zone. He had been there the week Eleanor treated the boy. When he answered, his voice cracked from age but carried the same steadiness she remembered. "Eleanor," he said after a pause, "you still sound like a fighter." She explained everything. Frank's condition, the scans, the growth, the dreams. There was silence on the line. "Then there was a file," he said. "I shouldn't have seen it, but I did. About the boy. They never gave him a name, just a code name, Cicada. Like the insect? No. Like the acronym? Centralized Infant Cognitive Adaptation Directive Agent. She froze. He was a project or a product? I never got the full story. But I remember this. They said the boy didn't age, not for years, said he had cellular anomalies, something about memory loops, regeneration. Eleanor gripped the phone tighter, and the triangle symbol appeared on his chart, stamped, black ink. I asked once, they said, don't ask again. The next morning, Eleanor made her decision. Frank couldn't stay in that hospital, not under observation, not while men in suits circled like wolves in silk. She packed a bag quietly, folded his clothes, and signed the release forms under a medical guardianship clause she had never expected to use. Doctor. Winters met her in the hallway. You're taking him out? I'm taking him home, Eleanor replied. The doctor paused, then reached into her coat pocket and handed over a sealed envelope. Then take this with you. His latest scan, and the tissue sample. It's not much. But it's yours, not theirs. Eleanor blinked. Why? Because I'm tired of letting policy speak louder than people. They exchanged no further words. Sometimes, solidarity speaks best in silence. That night, Frank was asleep in his own bed. Millfield was quiet again, winter thick in every crack of the windows, every frozen gutter. Eleanor sat beside him, the journal, the photo, the scan, spread out like puzzle pieces that didn't belong in the same box but fit all the same. She played the audio recording she had captured days ago, when Frank had spoken Vietnamese in his sleep. But now, she heard something different. A phrase, repeated. Quay Lai Di, come back where? She opened the scan again. The triangle mark glowed faintly in infrared, etched into the growth itself. It wasn't scar tissue, it was a map, or maybe a signature. And for the first time since this began, she knew what had to be done. They would go back to the place it started, to find the boy, to finish the story. There was something quietly defiant about two elderly Americans boarding a flight to Southeast Asia, with nothing but a leather-bound journal, a box of military artifacts, and a man whose body still bore the whispers of a forgotten war. Eleanor Mason sat by the window. Frank, asleep beside her, his head tilted toward the hum of the engine, looked deceptively peaceful, like a man finally heading home, though his home was a ghost village in the central highlands of Vietnam, erased from maps but not from memory. The airline crew, sensing something unusual in their composure, offered extra blankets, soft smiles, and left them largely alone. They didn't ask questions. People rarely do when they sense grief traveling in pairs. In her lap, Eleanor held Frank's last MRI image, printed, folded, red until nearly translucent. In the center of the mass on his scan, under thermal layering, was still that triangle, a mark not printed or inked but grown, like a cellular scar. Or a brand. Beside the scan was a small photograph Lily had handed over at the airport, a satellite image taken by a friend in the U.S. Geological Survey. It showed an area in the old Quang Tri province, flat, green but oddly blurred in the center, a smudge of land, a dead zone of resolution. As if something or someone had scrubbed it clean, the location lined up precisely with the coordinates scribbled in Eleanor's 1971 field journal. The village, when they landed in Da Nang, the air hit them like breath from an old story. Warm, wet, filled with scents of petrol, rice steam, and tropical rot. The airport was cleaner than it had been in the 70s, more glass, more English signs. But the heat hadn't changed, nor had the eyes of the older locals, sharp, observant, etched with years. They hired a driver named Min, a lean man in his 50s who spoke fluent English and wore an American baseball cap that had long lost its color. You here from memory? He asked them gently. Eleanor nodded. You could say that. Min didn't ask more. He drove, and the landscape unfurled like a memory she hadn't asked to remember. Paddy fields glinting in late afternoon light. Water buffalo waiting. Children on bicycles flying down cracked village roads. Tombstones in old French cemeteries, half swallowed by jungle. But then, as they turned off the main road, everything grew still. The air thickened. Min parked near a bend in the road where no path continued. Ahead was dense brush, vines, bamboo that had overgrown what once may have been a gate. No more road, he said. That's the point, Eleanor whispered. They got out slowly. Frank walked on his own, though his knees trembled with every step. In one hand, he held the envelope containing the photograph from 1971. In the other, the bullet fragment, cool, smooth, shaped like memory. A trail into the village was barely visible now, just impressions in the undergrowth. ghost steps of long-gone soldiers. They walked in silence for nearly a mile, then it came into view, or what was left of it. Stone foundations swallowed by ferns, a collapsed well, the warped frame of a door still standing without walls. Everything else had been reclaimed by time, by vines, by silence. But Eleanor recognized it. The banyan tree where she had triaged wounded. The clay oven where a woman had baked flatbread in the smoke of fallen roofs. The charred schoolhouse beam she had leaned against, crying when they'd told her the boy was gone. And then she froze. In the clearing, under a flowering tree, stood a man, thin still, wearing a white shirt and dark pants, hands behind his back. He had the posture of someone waiting, but not surprised. Frank stopped beside her. The man stepped forward. He was perhaps in his 60s, but his face, unlined, smooth, with eyes like liquid amber, told a different story. "I thought you might come," he said in perfect, lilting English. Frank's knees buckled slightly. Eleanor reached out. "You," Frank started. "You remember me," the man said gently. "You were the boy." The man nodded. "No longer," he said. "But yes, I was." I sat on old stones beneath the tree as the sun began to dip behind clouds. "My name," the man said, "is not important. It hasn't been spoken in decades. But you knew me once in pain, and I knew you in mercy." Frank stared at him. "They took you. The Americans. They said you were different." "I was," the man said, "not without sorrow. But not alone. There were others. Children who survived with pieces of the war embedded not just in their bodies, but in their biology. Things the weapons left behind. Not all of it was American. Some was older." He looked at Frank. "The bullet that struck you, it passed through my mother first." Frank blinked. The world spun slightly. "She shielded me. You tried to stop them. You did, but you were late. The bullet entered her heart. Then, you." Frank couldn't speak. "I felt it." The man continued, "All these years through you. I dreamed through you. I saw your house, your wife, your fear." Eleanor swallowed hard. "You were connected?" The man nodded. "Your tissue protected the fragment. Mine created it. We are halves of the same event." A pause. Frank whispered, "So what happens now?" The man looked at the sky. "That depends on whether you believe memory is meant to be shared or buried." The light filtering through the canopy had changed. It wasn't golden anymore. It was soft, muted, like the last breath before dusk. In the village that no longer existed on any map, Frank Mason sat facing a man who had once been a boy he had tried to save, and failed. Eleanor kept her distance, standing just beyond the circle of old roots, as if sensing something sacred in their proximity. The way the man sat, straight-backed but not rigid, reminded her of monks she'd seen in photos, serene but alert, holding centuries behind their stillness. Frank looked older than ever now, not from exhaustion but from gravity, the weight of two lives resting on one set of shoulders. The man spoke first. "There are others like you," he said softly. "Not many, but enough. People who carry fragments not just of war but of us, of something, before language, before sides." Frank stared at the bullet casing in his palm, the one removed from his back, smooth, inert now, but when he touched it, he still felt a pulse, not physical, memory. "Why me?" he asked. "Because you chose mercy," the man said, "and memory clings to mercy more than it does to violence." He extended his hand, open. Frank hesitated. Eleanor took one step forward. "You don't have to," but Frank shook his head gently. "I do." He placed the bullet fragment into the man's palm. And then something strange happened, not dramatic, not cinematic, just quiet. The man closed his hand, and for a moment the air seemed to hum, not loud, barely perceptible, but real. The leaves on the tree above them trembled, though there was no wind. Frank's shoulders eased, his chest rose and fell as if some internal pressure had been released. Then his eyes glazed. He didn't fall, he didn't scream, he just changed. His breathing slowed, his pupils widened, his mouth opened slightly as if to speak, but no sound came. The man stood, walked to him, and touched Frank's temple gently with 2 fingers. And that's when it began, and memories spilled into Frank's mind. But they weren't his. They were the boy's. The field hospital, the smell of morphine, the trembling hand of a red-haired nurse pressing cloth into a wound, the shadow of helicopters over rice fields, the warmth of his mother's back as she shielded him, the bullet, the pain, the silence that followed, then the metal. nestling into tissue, not rejected, not absorbed, merged. He saw corridors in a gray facility, men in lab coats, needles, CT scans, words he didn't understand. He saw other children, some younger, some crying, some silent like him, some who stopped aging altogether. He saw escape, he saw fire, he saw the jungle again. Then Frank remembered his own memories. Boots in mud, a trembling rifle, Harris screaming orders, and that boy, that same boy, staring up at him from the ground. And then, darkness. Frank slumped forward, unconscious. Eleanor rushed to him, but the man stopped her gently. He's not hurt. He's in between. She knelt beside her husband. Frank? The man looked at her, calm. He's holding memory now, not just his own. She turned toward him. Why give it back? Because memory must complete its circuit. You cannot bury trauma and expect it to stay quiet. It remembers itself, in blood, in cell, in dreams. She touched Frank's face. His skin was warm, calm, but if it hurts him, it also heals him, the man said. There are truths he was never allowed to hold. Now they are his, not as guilt, but as knowledge. A long pause. Then she asked, and what about you? He smiled faintly. I was only ever a vessel. The war made me one. The science tried to mold me. But he looked down at Frank. He was the first to see me as a child, not a threat. Eleanor's eyes filled. What will you do now? He turned toward the jungle beyond. There are others to find, others like him, carrying the unsaid, the unprocessed, the half-forgotten. Not all wounds bleed. Some, remember, and they left before nightfall. Min waited patiently near the trailhead, watching them approach as if he'd known what kind of story they were walking back from. How was it? He asked, softly. Eleanor helped Frank into the back seat. Necessary. Min didn't press. He started the engine. None a flight home. Frank slept nearly the entire way, his breathing steady, no murmuring, no twitching, just rest, genuine and uninterrupted. Eleanor watched the clouds out the window, one hand resting gently on Frank's. In her other palm she held a folded slip of paper the man had given her before they parted. On it, a symbol, a triangle. Below it, a name, not in English. But she could translate. It meant those who remember forward. She didn't know if it was a group, a program, or a prophecy. But she knew this. Frank was no longer haunted. He was part of something larger. And for the first time in decades, memory didn't feel like a wound. It felt like a path. The morning light in Millfield, Michigan, didn't feel real. After the heat of Vietnam, after the weight of jungles and memory in forgotten villages, the quiet frost outside their window looked like something borrowed from a different life. A cleaner life, a life untouched. But Frank Mason knew better now. Nothing is untouched. He woke before Eleanor, not with a start or a gasp, but slowly, deliberately, as if his body too had decided that the war inside him was over. He sat up in bed. No pain, no voices. No foreign language humming behind his tongue like an echo chamber, just clarity, and a memory that wasn't his, but now lived inside him. He rose, walked to the window, and touched the glass. Outside, the yard lay still under a soft white dusting, but in his mind, he could still see banyan trees, the boy's eyes. The moment when metal met flesh and became something more than a wound, it became a bridge. Later that day, Lily arrived. She hadn't expected to find her father up, dressed and sipping black coffee at the kitchen table like a man who hadn't collapsed in a surgical theater just weeks ago. You look, she began. Frank smiled gently. Like I got something off my back? She blinked, then laughed. You always hated puns. Maybe I just wasn't good at them. Eleanor poured her a cup of coffee, then handed her an envelope. Read this first. Inside were notes, scans, dates, the symbol of the triangle, the coordinates of the village, and the transcript. Frank's own words. He had written them down, everything he remembered. Only, some of the memories weren't his. The boy's memories had come through in bursts, like archived footage suddenly playing in the background of Frank's mind, and he remembered them with a clarity that frightened him. Language, he told Lily. Customs, scent, emotion. I didn't study them. I became them, briefly. Just enough to know it was real. Lily was quiet for a long time. Then she pulled out her laptop, opened a research folder marked MNEM12, Autologous Memory Encoding, a project she'd left dormant 5 years earlier, on biocellular memory storage. You remember what I was working on before I left research? She asked. Frank nodded. Cells that could carry memory signatures, like genetic bookmarks. She tapped the keys. This might prove it's more than theory. That evening, Lily ran a sample test on the fragment Dr. Winters had given them. She placed a tissue slide under the scope, activated the thermal overlay, and nearly dropped her mug. There, embedded in a spiral formation of collagen, were neural patterns. Not signals, structures, biological blueprints for memory encoding, like a foreign brain's architecture had been etched into tissue. Her hands shook. "This isn't just memory storage," she whispered. "It's memory transfer, across bodies, across time." She turned to Frank. "Do you know what this means?" He nodded. "It means we were never meant to carry our pasts alone. But not all doors stay closed." News of Frank's recovery had spread, quietly, but not invisibly. The hospital had filed a required report on the anomalous tissue sample. Someone at the federal level flagged it, and flagged Frank. 3 days later, a black SUV rolled into Millfield, then another, then a third. They didn't wear uniforms, but they didn't have to. Eleanor opened the door. "We're with a sub-office of the Department of Civil Biohazard Response," the man said. "Mr. Mason may be in possession of material deemed sensitive by the Federal Intelligence Registry." "You're late," she said, and closed the door. They knocked again. Frank met them this time. "What you're carrying," the man said, "has implications beyond comprehension. Weaponization, sentience transfer, intellectual contagion. You need to come with us." Frank didn't flinch. "You want what's in my head? We want what's now part of you." Frank smiled. "Then you're too late too. It's not just me anymore." Behind him, Lily stood. She stepped forward. "I'm the one who decoded it." The man blinked. Frank added, "And there's no way to extract what we've learned without destroying us both. And even if you tried—" Eleanor finished the sentence. "It's already begun replicating." And that night, the house went dark for 6 hours. Neighbors reported a temporary power failure, nothing unusual. But inside, Eleanor, Frank, and Lily were already preparing, uploading notes, encrypting data, sending messages. Not to the press. Not yet. But to other scientists, other people, those who had studied what governments had buried, researchers silenced, whistleblowers exiled. They called it Mosaic Protocol, a system of shared memory, passed through secure digital links, designed not to expose the truth immediately, but to protect it, build it, let it evolve. Just like the fragment in Frank. And 2 weeks later, Frank sat in a library, not in Millfield, somewhere warmer, quieter. He opened a notebook, wrote down a name, then another, then a memory, not his, but now also his. People began arriving. Not many, just 1 or 2 at first. Each of them carried something small, an injury, a scar, a dream that didn't belong to them, and a question: "Do you remember something that isn't yours?" The first woman arrived just after sunrise. She came by bus, wore a plain gray coat, and carried a canvas satchel with only one item inside: a photograph. It was cracked, sun-faded, folded along the middle where her fingers had traced it too many times. She knocked twice on the wooden door of the old library in Sedona, Arizona. Frank Mason answered. "You remember something?" he asked. The woman nodded. "Yes. A place I've never been. A man I never met, but I know his voice." Frank opened the door wider. "You're not the first." By week's end, there were 9 of them. Each came bearing fragments, an image, a name, a smell that haunted them. None of them had been to Vietnam. Few had even been born before the war ended. But each of them described the same phenomenon, a recurring dream, a language they'd never studied, a pain in the back, just beneath the skin, and a question that kept them awake at night: is this mine? And Lily began building a registry, anonymous, encrypted. She used the old Mosaic Protocol to create a network, not of patients, not of anomalies, but of witnesses. People who had inherited fragments of memory they could not trace genetically. Yet those fragments matched the scans, the triangle pattern, the neural echoes found in Frank's tissue. It was spreading, not as a virus, but as an invitation. Memory, they realized, wasn't just something recorded. It could be transferred, passed like seeds, rooted in empathy, watered by proximity. Frank once said, "When you carry enough pain for long enough, the body tries to share it, like heat through metal." And now others were warming. In the quiet of their new home, Eleanor wrote. She had never thought herself a writer. She was a nurse, a caretaker, a witness. But sometimes, it is the witness who must speak when others cannot. Her letter was not addressed to any one person. It was to the next generation. You may not believe the war mattered, that it was just another historical notch in a belt of blood, but I need you to know it mattered. Because it changed the cells of the people who survived it. My husband carried something inside him for 45 years. Not just guilt, not just metal, but memory that didn't belong to him, and it grew inside him like a child looking for a parent. And when it was finally heard, when it was returned to the one who needed it, peace followed. She paused, looked out the window. Frank was sitting in the garden sketching. He had taken up drawing again, something he hadn't done since college. His hands weren't steady, but his eyes saw clearer than ever. So when people tell you to forget, or to move on, or that remembering makes you weak, I ask you to do the opposite. Remember harder. Remember deeper. Remember forward. She folded the letter, placed it in a fireproof box, marked it with the triangle, and months passed. More letters came, from Montana, from Okinawa, from Angola, from places that had known war, displacement, or silence. People who had never met wrote with startling precision about events no textbook recorded. They described smells, gunpowder and jasmine. They described sounds, a helicopter rotor at 4 a.m., a child singing a lullaby in a dead dialect. Lily called it echo consciousness. Eleanor called it grace. Frank, he just listened. One evening, near the end of summer, Frank was walking alone near the edge of a wooded trail behind their house. The air smelled of pine and clay. The wind moved the tall grass in soft arcs, like an invisible child running their fingers across the earth. Then he saw him, a boy, no older than 6, standing barefoot among the stones, wearing a worn button down too large for his frame, his eyes dark, still, familiar. Frank froze. The boy looked up, smiled. Frank blinked, looked around, no one. The boy raised a hand, pointed to the sky. Frank followed his finger upward. The clouds were shaped like wings. Then the boy was gone. That night, Frank didn't mention it to Eleanor, not because he doubted it, but because he knew now. Some things are not meant to be confirmed, only carried. Later, Eleanor stood at her desk, placing her letter inside a padded envelope. On the front she wrote, "To those who inherit what cannot be buried." And beneath that, the past does not haunt us. It remembers us. And sometimes, it asks to be remembered back. 1. At the end of it all, Frank sat at a community-centered table surrounded by faces, some young, some old. They didn't speak much. They didn't have to. Each had a symbol, a triangle, small and quiet, pinned near the heart. It wasn't a cult. It wasn't a cause. It was just a conversation. A gathering of those who remember forward, not to relive pain, but to return it home. Sometimes, we think memories fade with time, but the truth is, the ones that matter most, they don't disappear. They wait. They wait to be faced, to be understood, to be passed on, not as pain, but as wisdom. If this story stirred something in you, a question, a memory, a moment you thought long forgotten, share it in the comments below. We read them, we feel them, and you never know who else might need your story too. And if you're drawn to stories like this, raw, human, unforgettable, don't forget to subscribe. Because the next one might just be yours.